The slap came first. Not the shouting, not the warning, just that sound. Sharp. Sudden. A sound that sliced through the air like breaking glass. "Get out of my base," he said. "Both of you. You're done here. Do whatever you want." He stood there, straightening his jacket, looking down at us like we were insects. One second, I was standing beside my father in the Admiral's office, trying to breathe through the tension, and the next, crack. His hand came down so fast it blurred. My father's head jerked sideways, his metals clinking against his chest. Before I could even gasp, another crack, this time across my face. I didn't even have time to flinch. The sting hit before my brain caught up. My cheek burned hot, my ears rang, my mouth tasted like metal. And in that frozen second, I realized what had just happened. The admiral of our unit, the man who'd once pinned those very medals on my father's chest, had slapped both of us. A father and daughter in uniform. In front of his aides. The room went silent. You could have heard the tick of the wall clock. The smell of coffee, floor wax, and arrogance hung heavy in the air. He stood there, straightening his jacket, looking down at us like we were insects. "Get out of my base," he said. "Both of you. You're done here. Do whatever you want." My father's jaw clenched. I saw his eyes glisten, not from pain, but from humiliation. This man had served 28 years, trained dozens of soldiers, saved lives, and this was how it ended? With a slap from someone half his age and twice as proud. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip the stars off that man's shoulders and throw them at his feet. But my body was locked in place, like the air itself was holding me still. My father quietly reached down and began picking up his medals, 1, 2, 3, each one making that faint clink against the tile. That sound broke me. You ever see someone you love humiliated and feel your own heart twist until it hurts to breathe? You want to protect them, to undo what just happened, but you can't. You just stand there, burning from the inside out. I swallowed hard. My face was still hot. My hands were trembling. But my voice came out steady when I finally spoke. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career, sir." He smirked. Didn't even look up. "That so, Lieutenant? Then do something about it." I didn't answer. Not with words. But I made a promise right there, one I whispered to myself under my breath as I helped my father to his feet. I will return that slap. Not with my hand. Not with anger. But with something that will echo through every corridor of the space. Because some hits don't bruise your skin, they bruise your soul. And the only way to heal is to strike back with truth. Before I tell you what I did next, how I kept that promise and made him regret every word he said, take a second. Hit like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Because this isn't just a story about revenge. It's about the day honor finally hit back. I grew up on bases that smelled like salt, metal, and jet fuel. When other kids were learning to ride bikes, I was learning how to salute. My father was a Navy SEAL before I could even spell the word discipline, the kind of man who believed that honor wasn't something you said, it was something you wore, like your skin. People used to joke that I was born wearing boots. In a way, I was. Every hallway I ever walked echoed with my father's footsteps. Every lesson I learned came with the sound of his steady voice. Do the right thing, even if it costs you. Back then, I didn't realize how expensive that promise would be. When I joined the service, I thought I was following in his shadow. Turns out, I was walking straight into a storm. My dad wasn't just a soldier. He was the man other soldiers turned to when things got ugly. But he also had this curse. He couldn't close his eyes when he saw wrong being done. He noticed numbers that didn't add up, shipments that went missing, deals that looked too clean to be honest. And instead of looking away like everyone else, he spoke up. That's how it started, the first crack in the wall. At first, it was small. A few whispers, some cold shoulders in the mess hall. Then the transfer orders came. He was moved from mission command to logistics oversight, a polite way of saying, we don't trust you with guns anymore. Still, he kept filing reports. One day he showed me a stack of papers, neat and precise, with names, dates, transactions. "They're bleeding money out of the defense fund," he said quietly. "It's not mistakes, it's theft. And the one signing off on it is the same man you salute every morning." He meant the Admiral. Back then, I didn't want to believe him. The Admiral had been a family friend once. He'd come to my mom's funeral, shaken my hand, told me I reminded him of her strength. I looked up to him, God, I looked up to him. I'd studied under his command, earned his approval. To me, he was what integrity looked like with stripes. So when my father started accusing him of corruption, it felt like betrayal. I told him, "Dad, maybe you're seeing ghosts." He looked at me with those tired eyes of his and said, "Maybe. But I've been in this world long enough to know ghosts don't forge signatures." He was right, of course. But by the time I realized it, it was too late. Word spread that he was digging into financial records that weren't his to see. He got called to a disciplinary review. That's what they called it on paper. In reality, it was a setup. A private meeting, no witnesses, no advocates. Just him and the Admiral. He asked me to come with him that day. He said, "You should see what honor looks like when it's cornered." I didn't know what he meant until we stepped into that office and the door closed behind us. That slap wasn't just about pride. It was a punishment for speaking truth where lies paid better. It was the sound of a system protecting itself. That's why it hit so deep. Because it wasn't just my face or my father's face that burned, it was every memory of what we thought the Navy stood for. He'd raised me to believe loyalty was sacred. But what do you do when loyalty and justice stop being on the same side? That's the part people don't tell you about the service. Betrayal there doesn't come like a movie scene with shouting and explosions. It comes quietly, through paperwork, through closed doors, through a slap from the very hand that once pinned your medals. After we walked out of that office, the base felt different. The air was heavier. No one met our eyes. It was like being cheated on by someone you defended your whole life. Suddenly, everything familiar felt fake. We packed our things in silence. My father folded his uniforms carefully, like he still respected them even when they no longer respected him. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him why he wasn't angrier. But he just said, "Anger's loud, truth is patient." That night, in our temporary quarters, he opened his laptop. I saw spreadsheets, coded files, a folder named Harbor Ledger. He'd copied everything, emails, contracts, the proof of every lie the Admiral had signed. "Keep it safe," he told me, sliding a flash drive across the table. "If anything happens to me, you know what to do." I didn't understand why his voice cracked when he said it. Now I do. That slap wasn't the end, it was the beginning. It wasn't about humiliation anymore. It was about inheritance. My father had passed something to me that day, and it wasn't just a flash drive. It was the weight of his unfinished war. The Admiral's office looked like something out of a recruitment poster, everything in its place, not a speck of dust daring to land where it didn't belong. Sunlight cut through the blinds in perfect, sharp lines, slicing across the floor, glinting off the brass corners of picture frames and the sharp edges of honor plaques. There was a flag in the corner, tall and proud, the kind of thing that made most people stand straighter just by being in the same room. That morning, the air inside didn't feel patriotic. It felt poisoned. You could hear the hum of the air conditioner, the faint ticking of the Admiral's watch. Every sound was amplified because no one dared to breathe too loudly. My father stood in front of the desk, hands behind his back, shoulders pulled square even though I could see the stiffness in his neck. I knew that stance. I'd seen him use it in interrogation rooms and funerals. It was the one you use when you're trying to keep yourself from shaking. The Admiral leaned against his desk like he was posing for a magazine cover, relaxed, confident, dangerous. He had that kind of smile you learn to fear after you've seen it once. The kind that says, "I already know I'm going to win, but go ahead, talk." He tapped a pen against a folder that had my father's name printed across the top. Each tap felt like a countdown. You know what your problem is, Commander? He said finally, his voice casual, almost amused. You don't understand when your time is over. My father didn't move. He just blinked slowly, the way he used to when he was deciding whether to speak or let silence do the talking. The Admiral chuckled. I mean, look at you. The Navy's sentimental old hero. Washed up. Still clinging to honor like it's a medal you can polish when everything else fades. I saw the muscle in my father's jaw twitch, but he said nothing. That was my breaking point. Sir, I said, taking a step forward before I could stop myself. My voice was shaking but steady enough to be heard. You're talking to a man who's earned the right to silence you. He turned his head slowly, and for the first time that day, his eyes met mine. There was no surprise in them. No anger. Just something darker, disgust maybe. Or disappointment that I dared to speak at all. The corners of his mouth curled into that smile again. He said softly, the daughter. The one who thinks legacy is a shield. He straightened, tugging his uniform jacket into place. You know, your father was once like you, idealistic, loud, painfully naive. He took a step forward, closing the distance between us. I could smell the faint trace of aftershave, sharp and chemical. His ring caught a strip of sunlight, and for a split second, the glint of gold blinded me. Then it happened. A sound that didn't belong in that kind of room. The slap landed before my brain caught up to what was happening. His hand cracked across my father's face with such force that his metals rattled against his chest. The noise echoed against the metal walls, bounced back, and filled the space until it became something alive, something vicious. My breath caught. My father stumbled a half step, steadied himself, then lifted his head. The red mark spread fast across his cheek, his skin already swelling. He didn't speak. He didn't even blink. And before I could process that, the Admiral turned to me. His hand moved so fast it was a blur. The slap that followed wasn't just sound. It was light, heat, pain, humiliation, all at once. It cracked through me like lightning. My head snapped to the side, my cheek stung, and for a second the room tilted. The flag in the corner blurred, the sunlight shattered across my vision. I tasted blood. Silence followed. Not quiet silence. The kind that roars in your ears, that fills your skull with the sound of your own heartbeat. Outside the door, I heard footsteps slow down, then retreat. They heard. They knew. No one came in. No one ever does. The Admiral adjusted his ring like he'd just done something trivial, like he'd brushed lint off his sleeve. You see, that's the problem with people like you, he said, his tone suddenly calm again. You mistake rank for righteousness. You think your family name gives you immunity. But in my Navy, no one is untouchable. He turned back to his desk, dismissing us with a flick of his hand. Get out. Both of you. You're finished here. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I stood there, frozen, my cheek burning, my mind replaying the sound over and over. My father's breathing was slow, controlled, too controlled. He bent down and started gathering the papers that had fallen from the desk during the slap. Each movement was deliberate, careful, as if he refused to let that man see him tremble. When he finally straightened, he turned toward the Admiral. His voice, when it came, was steady but heavy. You can take my title, sir. You can take my clearance. But you'll never take the truth. The Admiral didn't even look up. Truth, he murmured, almost amused. That's such an old-fashioned word. We walked out. Not because we accepted it, but because staying there another second would have broken something we could never fix. As the door shut behind us, I looked at my reflection in the glass. My face was red, my hair slightly loose from the impact. And I thought, that wasn't just skin and bone that stung. That was every principle I was raised on. The slap wasn't about power, it was about erasing who we were. It was meant to make us small, to turn our silence into consent. But standing there in that hallway, with my cheeks still pulsing and my father's pride bleeding in silence beside me, I realized something I'd never forget. He might have hit us. He might have humiliated us. But he had no idea what kind of fire he'd just lit. The Admiral's words hung in the air like smoke you can't breathe through. You're finished. Do whatever you want. That was it. No formality. No paperwork. Just that sentence, cold, casual, final. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on everything my father had built across 3 decades of service. For a long time, we didn't move. My father's eyes were locked on the flag in the corner, that same flag he'd sworn to protect before I was even born. I could see it in his face, how much it cost him to stand there and not break. The Admiral turned away, already done with us. He reached for another file, humming under his breath like the moment hadn't even happened. The man had just stripped a soldier of his honor and treated it like clearing his desk before lunch. My father's hand twitched slightly at his side. It wasn't anger, it was restraint. He leaned down and started picking up his medals, one by one, from where they'd fallen. I bent beside him, my own cheek still throbbing, my pride burning even hotter. Each medal clinked softly against the others, the sound too small for the weight it carried. They didn't look like honors anymore. They looked like tiny pieces of a man someone had tried to destroy. He left one behind. The Silver Star. The Admiral's boot had pinned it halfway under the desk. My father looked at it for a second, then straightened his back. "Leave it," he said quietly. His voice didn't shake, but his eyes did. I didn't ask why. I already knew. That medal didn't mean what it used to. Not in a room where justice had just been mocked. We turned to leave. I expected the Admiral to say something else, to throw one last insult, one last reminder of his power, but he didn't. He just waved a hand toward the door without looking up. That's the thing about men like him. They don't even need to shout to make you bleed. The walk down that hallway was the longest I've ever taken. Every step felt like walking through wet cement, heavy and slow. Officers stood frozen at their desks, pretending to read reports, pretending not to notice us. No one saluted. No one met our eyes. It was like we'd stopped existing the moment he'd said those words. Outside, the afternoon sun hit hard. It made the base shimmer, the runways, the hangars, the lines of soldiers moving in formation. Everything looked so painfully normal, like nothing had happened. My father stopped at the edge of the parade ground. The wind tugged at his uniform, and for the first time, I saw how tired he looked. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind that comes from fighting a system too big, too corrupt, too blind to remember the people who built it. He glanced back at the building we'd just left. His voice was low, almost like he was talking to himself. "They can take our rank," he said. "Not our truth." I wanted to believe him. But truth felt small just then, like a word without teeth. We walked toward the main gate. The guards didn't say anything. They just stepped aside, one of them shifting uncomfortably, like he didn't know whether to salute or look away. I caught his eyes for half a second. There was pity there. Maybe guilt. The clang of the gate closing behind us was louder than I expected. It sounded final. Outside the fence, the world looked different. The air smelled less like fuel, more like dirt and rain. There was a long stretch of road leading away from the base, empty and quiet. For the first time in my life, I realized how much of myself I'd left behind that fence. My father didn't speak for a while. He just kept walking, the medals in his hand clinking softly with each step. I followed beside him, trying to hold my head high even though everything inside me felt broken. When we reached the car, he stopped and looked down at the handful of medals. Then, slowly, he opened his palm and let them spill onto the ground. The sound they made when they hit the dirt, soft, final, almost gentle, broke something in me. He looked at me then, eyes red but steady. "They're just metal now," he said. "Honor doesn't live in these. It lives in what we do next." I swallowed hard. The words should have comforted me, but they didn't. Not yet. Because all I could think about was the Admiral's face, the smug tilt of his mouth, the way his hand had cracked across my father's skin without hesitation. The sound still echoed in my head, louder than anything else. I turned toward the base one last time. Through the chain-link fence, I could still see the Admiral's building. From this distance, it looked small, harmless even. But I knew better. Inside those walls, lies wore uniforms and truth got slapped across the face. I whispered, almost to myself, he'll regret those words. My father didn't ask what I meant. Maybe he already knew. Maybe he'd seen that look in my eyes before, the one that meant I wasn't done. As we drove away, I watched the base shrink in the rearview mirror until it was just a smudge against the horizon. It should have felt like freedom, but it didn't. It felt like betrayal, like walking out of a home you thought was yours only to find the locks changed. And somewhere deep inside me, underneath the ache and the humiliation, something started to form, a quiet promise that burned steady. He told us to do whatever we want. He had no idea what I was capable of when someone gave me permission like that. We got home that night long after sunset. The sky over Virginia was heavy with rain clouds, the kind that seemed to follow you just to make sure you don't forget what the day took from you. My father didn't say a word the whole drive. He just stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel, the faint reflection of the base lights fading behind us in the mirror. When we pulled into the driveway, the house felt smaller than I remembered. It was too quiet, too still, like it already knew something sacred had been broken. He went straight to his study without turning on the lights. I stood in the hallway, listening to the creak of the floorboards under his boots, the sound of drawers opening and closing. I didn't follow. I couldn't. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, just tracing the edge of a coffee mug, trying to swallow the taste of humiliation. My cheeks still stung from the slap, but it wasn't the skin that hurt, it was everything under it. It was the memory of the look on my father's face when that hand came down, the silence he held afterward, the medals left behind like bullets in the dirt. After a while, I heard him sigh. That sound, God, I'd known it since childhood. It was the sound he made when something in him cracked, but he wasn't ready to let it break. He came out of the study holding a small wooden box, the kind that once held his service coins. He placed it on the table, but he didn't open it. They'll come for me, he said quietly. They always come for the one who speaks first. I looked up at him. For what? For defending yourself. He shook his head. No. For defending what's right. That's when I saw it, the thing he wasn't saying. He wasn't just scared. He was tired. Not of fighting, but of fighting alone. Later that night, after he went to bed, I went into his study. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper. The walls were lined with photos, him in uniform, his unit overseas, a younger version of me on his shoulders, both of us smiling like the world was still good. His desk was messy for the first time I could remember. Papers, folders, an open notebook with half-finished sentences. On the edge of the desk sat a small flash drive, almost hidden under a pile of reports. I picked it up. It was scratched, dented, ordinary. But the label, tiny, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, read, "For truth." I plugged it into his old laptop. A password prompt appeared. I hesitated, then typed his old call sign, Anchor. The screen blinked once and opened. The folder inside was named Harbor Ledger. There were hundreds of files. PDFs, photos, scanned documents, even voice recordings. I opened one at random. It was an email exchange. My father to someone named E. Harlan, Procurement Division. The subject line read, Unauthorized Transaction Inquiry. The response was short. Drop it, Commander. Orders from above. My stomach turned. I opened another. This one was a memo from the Admiral himself, authorizing private testing and redistribution of Navy-grade weapon systems to a company called Vanguard Systems. At the bottom of the page was a signature, his, and next to it, the initials of a contractor I recognized. A man who'd been court-martialed 3 years ago for arms smuggling. My hands started to shake. I kept reading. Each document was worse than the last, contracts rerouted through shell corporations, money transfers disguised as maintenance expenses, private shipments sent to sanctioned regions. Every line dripped with the kind of corruption you don't stumble into. This was organized. Protected. I found a folder marked personal notes. My father's voice filled the room when I played the recording. It was shaky, exhausted. If you're hearing this, it means I couldn't fix it. I tried to go through channels. I tried to believe in the system I gave my life to, but the system's infected. The Admiral's not just covering a scandal, he's selling pieces of our country to the highest bidder. I can't prove all of it yet, but this is enough to start. If I disappear, if I'm silenced, you know what to do. The words froze me. If I'm silenced. I turned off the audio and sat there in the dark, staring at the flickering screen. It hit me then. He hadn't been demoted for incompetence. He'd been punished for telling the truth. That slap wasn't just humiliation. It was a warning. It was the system telling him, and everyone watching, what happens when you question power. The realization settled in like poison. He wasn't demoted for failure. He was silenced for honesty. And now I had the proof. I should have felt terrified. I didn't. I felt something sharper. Something cold. The kind of clarity that comes when you realize the thing you've been taught to protect has been protecting the wrong people all along. I unplugged the flash drive and held it in my palm. It felt heavier than metal. It felt like responsibility. Like inheritance. For years, my father had fought wars overseas for people he'd never met. He'd risked his life believing the enemy was always out there, on another shore, behind another gun. But the truth was uglier. The enemy had been sitting in an office 5 doors down, smiling for cameras and shaking hands with politicians. That night, I made a decision. If my father couldn't finish what he started, I would. I went to his bedroom. He was asleep, his breathing uneven, his hand resting on his chest like it still remembered the weight of his medals. I stood in the doorway and whispered, "You were right, Dad. You always were." He stirred, but didn't wake. Maybe that was for the best. What I was about to do, I couldn't drag him into. Not again. I slipped the flash drive into my pocket and looked around the room one last time. The photographs on the walls, the folded flag on the shelf, the Bible on his nightstand, all the symbols of service and sacrifice that were supposed to mean something. They still did. Just not the way the Navy had taught me. By the time the sun rose, I was already gone. My car was packed, my uniform folded neatly in the back seat, and the flash drive hidden inside the lining of my jacket. As the road stretched out ahead of me, I thought about the Admiral's words, "You're finished. Do whatever you want." He thought he'd humiliated us. He thought he'd buried the truth. But what he'd really done was give me permission. And I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I drove until the sky lightened, until the first pale edges of morning started cutting through the clouds. I needed a person who could move unseen and speak in whispers that other people listened to. I needed someone who knew how to make paper mean more than the men who signed it. His call sign was Falcon, an NCIS guy I'd trusted with small things before. Surveillance pulls, access to a camera feed, favors that never made it into memos. He was careful, quiet, and he hated injustice the way I did. I found him at a diner off the interstate, elbows on the Formica, drinking coffee like it was fuel for the next job. He looked the same. Dark hair, a constant 5 o'clock shadow, eyes that always seemed to be scanning for vulnerabilities. I slid into the booth across from him, and for a second the world narrowed to the hum of the place and the soft clink of forks on plates. "No one's going to help us unless you convince them they'll be safe," he said after I told him enough in the parking lot that we could be overheard. He never liked loud plans. He liked quiet, precise ones. "I've got proof," I told him. Emails, memos, shipment logs. He sold systems, Falcon. Navy-grade systems to a contractor that's a front. There are payments going to accounts that don't exist. My father copied everything before they came for him. Falcon didn't flinch. He took a slow sip of coffee and set the cup down like he was locking something into place. If that's true, you don't leak it to a journalist. If you go public without the right chain, the Admiral will have you arrested for treason and call it national security. He'll make you disappear on paper. We do this clean. We do this where it counts. We spent the whole day building the bones of what would become Operation Silent Strike. No code words, no theatrical plans, just work and patience. First, verify. Falcon had sources who could cross-check bank routing numbers, identify shell companies, and map the money trail. Second, secure a route to the Pentagon Ethics Board. If we went to Congress, the evidence wouldn't survive the spin. The Ethics Board could trigger a controlled investigation that forced the Justice Department's hand without letting the Admiral bury it in bureaucracy. Third, timing. We needed a moment that couldn't be silenced. Something public, something ceremonial where cameras would be present and the Admiral couldn't hide behind his office door. The Admiral's being honored next month, Falcon said. A gala. Medals, speeches, the works. He'll be surrounded by people who care how he looks. That's when he's most fragile. He wants the applause more than he wants truth. We'll use that. My throat tightened. The gala would be a risk in every sense. It was public. It was formal. It would have security like a small fortress. If we were caught, the narrative would be set before justice even started. But the memory of the slap was a bright, white-hot brand on my cheek, and in my memory, public humiliation deserved a public answer. And if the Admiral would stage his virtue on a stage, I would expose his vice under the same lights. Dad will say it's treason, I said. He will, Falcon agreed. Because they'll call it treason. And they'll make you the criminal for stepping over the line they drew. But that's why we protect the line, so the truth has someone to stand on when they try to crush it. That night I spoke to my father in the soft dark of his living room. He sat with his hands clasped, like he was steadying himself against something heavy. No lectures. No pleading. Just that tired look and an understanding that ran deeper than talk. They'll pin everything on you, he said simply. They'll try to make you small, like a lesson. They'll make an example. So, what do we do? I asked. He looked at me for a long time and then reached out, taking my hand like I was 8 again. You finish what I started. But you don't let them write the story. They'll call it treason. You call it truth. We started recruiting quiet allies, people who had seen the small anomalies and knew something smelled wrong. A logistics NCO who'd noticed shipments flagged maintenance that never came back, a comptroller with a soft spot for audits, a clerk whose conscience finally cracked. Each one was a thread. Alone, weak. Together, enough to pull at the seams. Falcon handled the technical side. He mapped the gala, entrances, exits, camera placements, where the Admiral would stand, and where his security detail clustered. He found where the press would be held and where the staff would route the overflow. He made notes on the signal strength for the Wi-Fi, for the comms, for the radio channels the MPs used. We weren't going to be sloppy, we were going to be surgical. I rehearsed what I would say. Not lines, truth doesn't fit in lines, but the way I would stand, the way I would hold a folder, the way I would let silence sit heavy for a second before throwing it into the room like a stone. My father practiced too, in his own way, slowly, by recounting facts and dates. He didn't need to be the one who spoke. He had done enough through his life. But having him ready made something solid under my feet. The days before the gala were a blur of small betrayals. People who had looked us in the eye now petitioned the Admiral's side. Emails came from unknown addresses warning me to stop. My car was followed twice. Once, I caught the reflection of the taillights in my rear view and felt a hollow drop in my chest I'd never known. Fear was a different animal now. It wasn't about the slap or the humiliation. It was about whether I was ready to be the person who would answer for both of us. Falcon taught me how to move documents so they couldn't be scrubbed. We made copies, encrypted them, and then made copies of the copies. OneDrive lived with a retired JAG who owed Falcon a favor. One was split across servers in places we would neither name nor visit in public. We printed a dossier and left it with a woman at the Pentagon we trusted, someone who had called herself a bureaucrat, but had a streak of righteousness so stubborn it made her dangerous. We fed the ethics board just enough for them to open a preliminary inquiry without giving them everything they needed to be stopped. We rehearsed contingencies. If they tried to arrest me on the spot, Falcon had people ready to block the narrative. If the Admiral tried to discredit the documents, we had forensic timestamps, independent verifications, audio captures. If the press tried to spin it, we had a slow drip of evidence timed to keep pressure while the investigation did its work. On the night of the gala, the city was dressed in its flashing lights. I wore my dress uniform, the one that felt both like armor and a memory of everything that had been taken. I'd had Falcon stitch a small pocket inside the lining of my jacket, hidden, a place only I would think to check. In that pocket was the backup drive, the most irrefutable collection of files I owned. If everything else failed, that drive would still exist outside their network. We drove separately. I parked in a legal lot several blocks away and walked in with the crowd, officials, contractors, press, wives with pearls, and men with suspiciously new tuxedos. The room smelled of perfume and expensive cologne, the hum of polite conversation wrapped around me like a net. The Admiral stood at the podium, handsome in his medals, a smile practiced and patient. He took everything the room wanted to give him: admiration, trust, deference. My heart thudded like a fist against my ribs. It always does before you do something you can't take back. Falcon was a shadow at the edge of the crowd, his fingers tapping a rhythm on the phone. I could see the way he watched the doors, the press area, the way his gaze flicked to the MPs. He gave me a small nod, the signal that the line we'd drawn had been laid right. When the Admiral rose to speak, the room leaned in. He spoke about service, about sacrifice, about the meaning of a medal. People applauded. I watched the faces, wives, old soldiers, children of men who had signed those medals. I thought about my father, about his steady hands, about the way silence had lived in him like a second skin. The plan was simple on paper and terrifying in reality. I would stand up during the speech. I would walk to the podium. Falcon's people would ensure the press cameras swung my way. I'd hand the folder to the camera, and he'd play the audio, proof of authorization, the transactions, the shipments. The ethics board contact would be waiting in the wings with warrants ready. It was the cleanest way to force their hand without letting the Admiral suffocated in his office. When I rose, someone called my name. People turned. I felt like I was moving underwater. My legs were steady, my voice was not. I walked. Everyone's eyes found me and then the Admiral. The world contracted to the distance between me and that podium. He watched me approach like a hunter watching something small that wandered into his domain. There was almost amusement on his face. He smiled as if I were a curiosity. He didn't know what I carried. I set the folder down. I let the fabric of the moment sit heavy. Then I pressed play. The room filled with a voice that wasn't my own, not a speech but a recording. The Admiral's voice, crisp and official on a file dated months earlier, authorizing a transfer labeled testing with codes that meant payment sent. The contractor's voice on the other end, familiar. Names. Account numbers. Shipments rerouted. The sound of truth crackled through speakers like a live wire. Silence slammed into the room, hard enough to make people gasp. Then movement, dozens of heads turning like a single animal's reflex, murmurs threading out, and the flash of cameras. Falcon's contacts moved. The ethics board liaison stepped forward. The Admiral's smile faltered. For the first time that night, he looked unmoored. They tried to shout it down, to call it a forgery, to say this was a personal vendetta. They began to organize a counter-narrative right there, words forming in the mouths of men who'd been taught to protect their own. But we had prepared for that. Experts were on standby to verify timestamps. Bank auditors were already on phones to freeze accounts. The room was no longer just a stage for his honor, it was a spotlight on his ledger. My father watched from the back, hands folded, his eyes on me like a compass finding north. He'd warned me about treason, about being made to look like the enemy. I'd known the risk. But when I saw him standing there, steady, proud, despite everything, I felt something settle. This was no longer about my cheek or his shame. It was about making sure the men who'd trusted us with their lives knew the truth. Operation Silent Strike worked because we didn't explode. We exposed. We forced the system to show its face. The Admiral lost something you can't give back in a room full of people who'd once given him their loyalty, credibility. When you stand and tell the truth in a place built for pretense, the truth becomes a weight that pulls everything else down with it. Afterward, when the MPs tried to move in and the Admiral shouted orders that suddenly felt thin and helpless, I realized how fragile the version of power he'd built really was. It had been protection by proximity, medals, rank, appearances. Once those were questioned by evidence, the armor was paper. We walked out of that room into a new kind of noise. Reporters, questions, flashing cameras, the low murmur of men who suddenly felt their world had a hole in it. My father met me outside, eyes wet and steady. He said one thing, "You did right." They called it many names in the headlines. Some called me a whistleblower, others a traitor. The Admiral called me disloyal. But the ethics board had what it needed to open a formal inquiry. And that, more than anything, began to undo the protection the Admiral had woven around himself. I knew then that there would be a cost. I expected threats, cold shoulders, investigations into me, into my father, into anyone who'd touched this story. But there was also something else, a small, fierce truth that didn't belong to rank or medals. It belonged to people left holding the cost of other men's decisions. Operation Silent Strike didn't end the war. It started it in a way that mattered. It took the slap off my face and turned it into a question the nation had to answer. Who do we honor and why? The ballroom glittered like a lie everyone agreed to believe in. Crystal chandeliers dripped light across the polished marble. A string quartet played something that was supposed to sound noble, and every face in the crowd was turned toward the stage where the Admiral stood. He looked untouchable, silver hair trimmed to regulation, medals catching the light with every breath, his posture carved out of arrogance and ceremony. I stood in the back, near the service corridor, watching him bask in applause that didn't belong to him. He was talking about valor, about sacrifice, about the men and women who defend the truth. The words rolled easily off his tongue because lies always do when they've been rehearsed long enough. Each sentence was a slap all over again. Each pause for applause was another bruise that never healed. Falcon was somewhere near the press riser. I caught the small flick of his hand, the signal that the mics were live, the feeds were clean, the press cameras were rolling. Everything was ready. I adjusted my uniform, the one they said I no longer had the right to wear, and stepped out from the crowd. My shoes clicked on the marble like a countdown. People turned. The sound of my movement rippled through the room, soft at first, then building a low wave of surprise that quieted the orchestra mid-note. The Admiral looked up from the podium, that smile still perfectly in place, but his eyes sharpened the moment he recognized me. You could almost hear his thoughts shifting gears, preparing the polite smile for the cameras, the cold fury for later. "Admiral," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like the crack of a rifle. Hundreds of eyes turned. The cameras did too. I walked until I was standing just below the stage, looking up at the man who had once called my father a fool. My voice didn't tremble. It didn't need to. The kind of anger I carried had already burned past fear. "Do you still slap those who tell the truth?" The question hung there, suspended between us, electric and dangerous. The Admiral blinked once. The room froze. Someone in the crowd coughed, and it echoed through the hall like a gunshot. "Excuse me," he said finally, his voice smooth, practiced. I stepped closer. "You heard me. Do you still slap the men who expose your lies, or do you just pay them to disappear now?" Gasps rippled through the audience. The journalists, hungry for anything that smelled like scandal, lifted their cameras higher. He tried to laugh it off, a small chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. "Lieutenant, this isn't the time or place." "That's what you said when you hit my father," I interrupted. "You told us to get off your base and do whatever we wanted. So here I am, doing exactly that." He opened his mouth, but before he could shape another lie, I reached into my jacket and held up the small device Falcon had given me, a sleek black remote no bigger than a lighter. I pressed the button. The sound system popped, and then the Admiral's own voice filled the ballroom. "Initiate the transfer under Vanguard systems. Mark it as equipment testing. I'll handle the oversight." Another voice responded, "But sir, that shipment is. Just do it. And don't put my name anywhere near it." The recording was clear, undeniable. His voice, his orders, his corruption echoing off marble and glass for everyone to hear. You could feel the oxygen leave the room. The Admiral's face drained of color. Around us, the guests began to whisper, low and urgent, the kind of whispers that grow teeth. Some pulled out their phones. Others just stared, caught between disbelief and awe. He reached for the microphone. "That recording is fabricated," he said, his voice brittle now. "This is an outrageous attempt." I cut him off again. "You forged the contracts. You rerouted the funds. You sold what you were sworn to protect." My voice wasn't angry anymore. It was steady, quiet, like the moment before a storm you know is coming. He tried to speak, but the ethics board representative was already on the move. Two officers stepped onto the stage. The orchestra hadn't moved, the string players frozen mid-bow. Cameras flashed like lightning. For the first time, I saw something raw flicker across his face. Not anger, not power. Fear. The kind that lives in men who finally see their lies unravel faster than they can patch them. I turned toward the crowd, my hands trembling only slightly. "That," I said, nodding toward the speakers, "was the real ceremony. That was the truth your medals were built to hide." No one clapped. They didn't need to. The silence said everything. Security moved toward the Admiral, but he didn't fight. He just stood there, shoulders rigid, eyes glassy under the chandelier light. I took one last look at him and said, "That was the moment I returned your slap, sir. Not with my hand, but with the truth." Falcon met my gaze from across the room. He gave a single nod. Somewhere behind me, my father's voice rose softly, steady, proud. "That's my daughter." The reporters surged forward, questions flying, flashbulbs popping. But I didn't answer any of them. I just walked out through the same doors I'd entered, the sound of the recording still echoing behind me, the echo of justice louder than the applause that used to fill that room. Outside, the night air hit cold and sharp. I took a breath that felt like the first real one in months. For the first time since the slap, my face didn't burn, it felt free. And as I looked up at the Navy flag waving above the building, I realized something simple and devastating. Sometimes, honor doesn't live in the ranks that wear it. Sometimes, it's carried out quietly by the ones they try to break. They took the Admiral out of that ballroom in silence. No cuffs, not yet, just two NCIS officers at his sides, their faces expressionless, their hands light on his elbows. The cameras followed him all the way to the door, the flashbulbs popping like gunfire. He didn't look back. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he finally understood what it felt like to be the one people turned away from. I didn't stay to watch him leave. I couldn't. I walked straight outside, into the night air, where the hum of engines and sirens swallowed the echo of his voice still looping in my head. Falcon found me there. He didn't say much, he never did, but the look in his eyes was enough. "It's done." The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Messages. Missed calls. Unknown numbers. News anchors, journalists, even old classmates suddenly pretending we'd always been close. My name was everywhere. SEAL scandal exposed by father-daughter duo. Admiral under investigation for arms diversion. Hero or traitor? Whistleblower lieutenant speaks truth to power. Some called me brave. Others called me reckless. The truth didn't care what they called me. It had already done its job. The Navy responded fast, too fast. Public statements, internal reviews, talk of temporary suspension pending verification. They wanted to look like they were cleaning house before anyone asked how the dirt had piled up in the first place. But in the small circles, the whispers were different. They said I'd embarrassed the institution, that I'd broken protocol, that maybe I'd done it for attention. And my father, he watched it all from the sidelines, the same way he'd watched that slap land across my face. Quietly, but not passively. They reinstated him a week later. No press release, no handshake, no apology. Just a letter from command saying, rank restored, effective immediately. That was their way of saying we were wrong without ever using the words. He didn't frame it or hang it up. He just folded it in half and tucked it into his old service journal. I didn't need their ceremony, he said when I asked how it felt. Just needed my name clean again. But even clean names carry scars. The first time we went to the grocery store after the story broke, I saw people whispering near the frozen aisle. Some looked at me with admiration, others looked at me like I'd betrayed something sacred. A woman stopped me once, a stranger. She said her brother had served under the Admiral and that I'd ruined a good man's legacy. Then she walked away before I could answer. That was the thing no one told me about doing the right thing. It doesn't come with applause. It comes with isolation. Inside the Navy, I became a story they told in two different tones. To some, I was the one who had the guts to stand up when it mattered. To others, I was the one who broke rank and humiliated the chain of command. It depended on who was talking and what they needed to feel right about themselves. Falcon warned me it would happen. They'll rewrite you, he said one night over coffee, eyes still scanning the room out of habit. That's how institutions survive. They'll call it justice today and betrayal tomorrow. Don't let them take your version. I tried to hold on to my version, the one that started in an office where sunlight fell across my father's medals like broken glass. The one that ended in a ballroom where truth finally echoed louder than rank. But it's strange how quickly the world moves on. One week you're headline news, the next you're a footnote. The Admiral's trial dragged through the courts. Pleas, denials, procedural delays. He blamed subordinates. He claimed ignorance. They found enough evidence to prove negligence, enough guilt to end his career. Not enough to put him behind bars for life. Justice, they called it. Half justice, I thought. Still, I went to the sentencing. I sat in the back row, quiet, while the judge read the verdict. The Admiral looked older. Smaller. Like the uniform had finally grown heavier than he could bear. He didn't look at me. Maybe he couldn't. Afterward, a reporter caught me outside the courthouse. She asked, "Do you feel vindicated?" I thought about it. The question hung there, big and hollow. No, I said. I feel tired. Because that's what people don't understand about truth. It doesn't set you free. It just sets things in motion. My father went back to work eventually, but it wasn't the same. He wasn't invited to briefings. He wasn't asked to lead. They said it was administrative reassignment, but we both knew what it meant. The Navy didn't like reminders of its own wounds. He wore his reinstated rank like an echo, visible, but distant. We spent more time at home after that. Some nights he'd sit on the porch, the same quiet hum in his chest, and say, honor's funny. They teach you it's a medal, a salute, a ceremony. But it's really just the way you live when no one claps. And I'd nod, because I was learning that lesson every day. There were moments of peace, though. Letters from people I'd never met, young officers, veterans, widows, telling me that what I'd done gave them courage. One man wrote, "My son was afraid to speak up about corruption in his unit. After your story, he did." I read that one twice. It made the cost feel less heavy, if only for a moment. But there were darker messages too. Threats. Anonymous emails. Promises that I'd regret bringing shame to the service. The kind that come from people who love the idea of integrity, but hate the mess it leaves behind. Falcon disappeared for a while, working another case, living in the shadows the way he preferred. When he resurfaced, he sent me one line: "You returned the slap. Don't let them slap you back with silence." That stayed with me. Because that's what the aftermath really was, a slow war between silence and memory. Between moving on and refusing to forget. The Navy eventually moved to close the case, label it resolved. But you can't resolve something that cracks your faith. You just learn to walk differently because of it. My name still circulates in the halls I once walked, but it doesn't belong to me anymore. It's a story now. A warning, a lesson, depending on who's telling it. And maybe that's all right. Maybe that's how truth lives, passed from one mouth to another, reshaped, retold, but never completely buried. Sometimes, when I see my reflection in the mirror, I catch a faint line of red that isn't really there anymore, a ghost of that slap. And I realize it's not a scar, it's a reminder. The cost of doing right isn't applause. It's solitude. But solitude, at least, is honest. And if that's the price for keeping my father's name clean, for proving that honor doesn't need permission, then I'd pay it again. Every single time. They called it a hearing. But when I walked into that Senate chamber, it didn't feel like justice, it felt like theater. Polished wood, flags perfectly draped, microphones shining under two bright lights. Cameras lined the back wall like silent vultures. The air was heavy with that kind of cold civility powerful people wear when they've already decided what they believe. My boots clicked against the marble as I took my seat at the long witness table. A glass of water waited for me. I didn't touch it. My hands stayed still, folded on the polished surface in front of me. I could see my reflection faintly in the shine, the faint shadow under my eyes, the sharpness in my jaw I didn't used to have. They called my name. Lieutenant Commander Avery Shaw, United States Navy. I stood, took the oath, and sat down again. The senators watched me like I was a case study, half hero, half problem. Some smiled politely. Others didn't bother pretending. There were medals on some of their jackets, pins that said they knew service, but none of them knew the kind that left bruises you couldn't show. The chairman leaned forward. "Commander Shaw, you understand you are here today to answer questions regarding your actions in the matter of Admiral Cole's exposure and subsequent arrest?" "Yes, sir," I said. He nodded, fingers steepled under his chin. "You acted outside of official channels, without authorization, and in direct violation of Navy Code." I kept my eyes on him. "Yes, sir." He raised an eyebrow. "You also exposed a high-ranking officer on national television. Some might say you undermine the very institution you claim to protect." I didn't blink. "Sir, I exposed a man who sold weapons meant to protect our country. The institution was already undermined. I just pulled off the cover." A murmur rippled across the room. I could hear pens scratching, staffers whispering, cameras zooming in. He leaned back slightly. "You lost your commission, your career, and you nearly destroyed your father's reputation in the process. So I'll ask you plainly, Commander." He paused, letting the silence stretch, the way people do when they want to make something sound profound. "Would you do it again? Knowing what it cost you?" The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. For a moment, I thought about what he was really asking. Not about rules or codes, but about regret. About whether I'd trade truth for peace, if I could rewind everything: the slap, the humiliation, the headlines, the whispers. I thought about my father sitting behind me in the gallery. I didn't need to look to know he was there. I could feel him, steady, patient, the way he always was when the world tried to take something from us. And I thought about that morning in the Admiral's office. The sound of his hand hitting my father's face, the metals scattered across the floor, the light burning through the blinds like judgment itself. I looked back at the chairman. My voice came out soft, but it carried. "Yes, sir," I said. "I'd do it again." His eyes narrowed. "Even knowing you'd lose everything?" "Yes, sir," I repeated. Because silence is the real betrayal. That sentence didn't come from anger, it came from something deeper. Something older. The kind of truth that's been carved into you by pain and consequence until it stops being an opinion and starts being who you are. The room stayed still for a beat. Then a sound broke it, the faintest clap. One person in the back. I didn't turn, but I knew. My father. He didn't smile wide, just a small curve at the edge of his mouth, pride contained in discipline. It was the same look he used to give me as a kid when I finally did something right, something hard, something he'd been waiting for me to understand on my own. The chairman cleared his throat. Commander, you've made it clear you value truth over hierarchy. But what would you say to those who argue that loyalty to command is what keeps this country safe? I took a breath. Loyalty without conscience isn't service. It's slavery. The oath we take isn't to a man, or even to a uniform. It's to the idea of right, and that idea doesn't change just because the room gets uncomfortable. The woman to his left shifted, her pen tapping lightly. And where do you draw the line, Commander? When does truth become defiance? I met her gaze. When the people in charge start confusing obedience with honor. Silence again. This one didn't feel tense. It felt awake. I wasn't supposed to say those things. I wasn't supposed to sound sure. I was supposed to play the part remorseful, careful, apologetic. But the truth had already cost me everything it could. What else could they take? One senator asked about the flash drive, another about Falcon, another about whether I'd coordinated with the press. I answered them all. Calmly. Plainly. No theatrics. Just facts. And when I finished, there was a stillness in the room that didn't come from authority. It came from recognition. From people realizing they'd just heard something they couldn't unhear. Afterward, as the hearing adjourned, the senators stood and filtered out, talking to aides, checking their watches, shaking hands. For them, it was another file to close, another headline to ride. For me, it was something else. I stood too, but I didn't move right away. I let my hand rest on the table, the wood warm under my palm. The glass of water was still there, untouched, rippling slightly from the movement in the room. I watched the reflection of the flag in it, blurred, imperfect, but still upright. That's what truth was, I thought. Not spotless. Not symmetrical. Just steady enough to stand. When I finally turned, I saw my father waiting near the back, hands clasped behind his back, that faint, proud smile still ghosting his lips. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time, peace. He mouthed the words, "You did it." And maybe for the first time, I believed him. Outside, reporters waited, lights flashing, questions flying. I didn't stop for any of them. I walked past the microphones, past the noise, down the steps of the Capitol, and into the sunlight that hit my face just right. It felt different this time. Not like judgment. Not like exposure. It felt like grace. The same light that once glared through the Admiral's blinds now warmed my skin without burning. It reminded me that truth, even when it wounds, can still heal slowly, quietly, but completely. And as I walked away, my father beside me, the echoes of that room fading behind us, I realized something simple and final. The slap wasn't just something that happened to us. It became the lesson we left behind. A lesson that honor isn't the medal you wear on your chest, it's the courage you keep when everything else is stripped away. That slap burned my skin for days. Even after the redness faded, I could still feel it, the sting that wasn't on the surface anymore, but somewhere deeper, somewhere words can't touch. But the truth it woke in me, that never went away. It's strange how pain has a way of teaching you things you could never learn in peace. That moment, that single act of humiliation, stripped everything I thought I knew about loyalty and left me standing face to face with what it really means to serve. Not a man. Not a system. But a principle. I used to think honor was something given to you, a medal, a title, a handshake after a long mission. Now I know it's something you hold on to when everything else has been taken. It's the thing that stays when silence becomes easier than truth. My father taught me that without saying a word. He didn't need to. He lived it. And that day, when he walked out of the Admiral's office with his head still high, he didn't just walk away from a uniform, he walked into a kind of freedom that no rank can buy. Sometimes I still hear that slap in my dreams. Not the sound of it, but the moment after, the silence. The way the air changed, heavy and sharp, right before everything inside me shifted. It wasn't rage that took hold of me that day. It was purpose. Because sometimes, the only way to honor those who raised you is to raise your voice when they can't. To speak the words they were punished for saying. To stand in the same room where they were broken and make sure the truth they carried doesn't die in silence. The world still talks about what happened. Some call it rebellion, some call it courage. But for me, it was never about revenge. It was about redemption, not just for me, but for my father, for everyone who's ever been told that obedience is worth more than conscience. And if you've ever been told to do whatever you want, remember, that's exactly what the brave do. They do what's right, not what's easy. They tell the truth even when it costs them everything. They take the slap, and they turn it into something that echoes long after the sound fades. That's what I did. That's what I'll keep doing. Because honor doesn't shout. It doesn't beg to be seen. It just stands quietly, waiting until it's called to strike back. If this story found you when you needed it, if it reminded you that silence isn't strength, that truth has its own kind of victory, then share it. Let it reach someone who's still standing in that quiet after their own slap, wondering if they're strong enough to fight back. Like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from, not for the numbers, not for the reach, but because voices like yours make this mission matter. Because every time one person chooses courage over comfort, the world becomes a little harder to corrupt. And maybe that's what honor really is, not the medals, not the headlines, just the echo of truth that refuses to die.